prep week. So today, the plan today is to go over the question from yesterday. So I hope you came prepared. I hope you did yesterday's question. Simulating what it's going to look like when you take the AP exam on May 21st. So let's jump right into it. Let's just do this. So this was the question that you're dealing with on question one. And to remind you what we're looking at here, this particular question was adapted from a couple of old questions, previously asked questions on old exams. And question one this year is designed to be two short questions put together. So that's what this is. It's two shorter questions, questions 2 or 3, put together into one to make it a longer question. You had 25 minutes to complete it. So what we're looking at may look familiar. Your teacher may have used portions of either one of these questions or the whole thing at some point. I know I did in my class. I used both of these questions at one point. So it may have been familiar from that perspective, but again, without the graphs and without some of the other components, it does take a slightly different form, and that's what we want to talk about today. That said, the fundamentals don't change. So let's start with parts A and B of number 1. The following is a simplified balance sheet for Solo Bank in the United States. Now you've got a balance sheet, a T account question. Always start by just interpreting what you're looking at. Remember, a problem well defined is half solved. You've got to do that first. So take a little bit of time and look at it. You've got assets and liabilities. This is always the case. The two sides have to be equal. What they did here is a little unique. This doesn't always happen. They don't have to do it this way, but they've actually split up bank reserves into required and excess. So you see you have $10,000 in required reserves, $5,000 in excess. I might jot down somewhere, I've got 15,000 total bank reserves. It might be helpful to just keep that in mind. And then you've got $85,000 in loans. That's an entrant. The entry of loans on a T account confuses a lot of students. Remember what that means. That $85,000, someone's already borrowed that money. It's not available for new loans. Somebody already borrowed it. It's gone. Add those 3 and you get 100,000. On the liability side, you get $100,000 in demand deposits. That means there is 0 owner's equity. So it all works out. Everything's bounced out like it should be on a T account. Keep in mind what demand deposits are. That's your depositors putting their money in the bank. So that's $100,000. The bank is liable to those depositors. They have to give it back to them if they want it. All right, part A, calculate the reserve requirement. All right, well, they've done everything we need right up here. You've got right in front of you $10,000 in required reserves. Total demand deposits are $100,000. We should know the reserve requirement is always a percentage of demand deposits. So if the T account's telling us they have to keep $10,000 on reserve, what is that as a percentage of demand deposits? It's 10%. So the reserve requirement is 10%. Remember, you have to show your work, and that's why I wrote it like this, by the way. It's the 10,000 over the 100,000 to get your 10%. You don't have to show necessarily every step, but at least show how you set it up. All right, now assume that Ray withdraws $5,000 cash from her checking account at Solo Bank. Well, again, I get a question like this. I'm going to go ahead and mark up that T account a little bit. And again, this year, because it's all online, have a sheet of paper, have some scrap paper nearby, maybe draw the T account and work through it that way. So when she takes that $5,000 out, that's coming directly out of demand deposits, but it's also going to affect bank reserves on the other side. It has no effect on loans. Your bank deposits are going to go down. Your bank reserves are going to go down because she's taking that money out as cash. And if I go ahead and make that adjustment on my T account, there's a good chance that I've already done a lot of the work that's needed to answer the following questions, and I can refer back to the changes and adjustments that I've made. So B1, by how much will Solo Bank's reserves change based on Ray's withdrawal? All right, remember, this is total bank reserves. It's not asking excess or required. It's simply saying total bank reserves. They started with 15,000. She took out 5. That's going to decrease total bank reserves by $5,000. The total bank reserves after her withdrawal are now $10,000. What's the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money supply? Explain. Okay. Remember, you need to know M0, M1, M2, and know what composes those 3 types of money supply. In this case, that $5,000 withdrawal has no effect on the M1 measure of money supply. It only changes the composition. The money went from checkable deposits to cash. Both are counted as M1. There is no effect on M1. So no effect. And then part 3, calculate the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of Solo Bank after the withdrawal based on the reserve requirement from Part A. So you have a 10% reserve requirement. What that tells me is after the $5,000 has been taken out, she took out the $5,000, demand deposits dropped down to $95,000, required reserves now are $9,500. There's still $10,000 total bank reserves. So anything exceeding that $9,500 would qualify as excess reserves. Therefore, the new value of excess reserves is $500. That's where those numbers are coming from. Okay. Now you'll notice I'm not telling you any point totals right now. I don't know how the points are going to be distributed on any rubrics or any scoring guides for this year's exam. My recommendation on top of that is don't worry about it. Answer the questions, answer them as thoroughly as you can. The numbers are going to take care of themselves. I don't think it's really beneficial while you're in the middle of an exam to be worried about points. Focus your energies on accuracy, consistency, being logically consistent, being thorough in terms of how you answer the questions. Okay, so that's parts A and B. Let's move on to part C. Part C is still Solo Bank. Assume the next day Ben withdraws from Solo Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. Assuming no loans are called in, how can Solo Bank cover its required reserves? So Ben comes, he's a depositor, and he takes out $1,000. There's only $500 in excess reserves. He takes out $1,000. What are they going to do? The bank's going to have to borrow money. They're not calling in their loans. They're going to have to borrow money, and they have two options there. They could borrow money from the Fed, this is in the United States, or they could borrow money from another bank. That's it. Those are their options. Part D. Well, it's probably obvious. This is where we shift gears. This was actually a separate question put together because they were common topics. The government reduces the tax rate on household interest earnings. What will happen to private savings? Okay, think through that first sentence. They reduce the taxes on household interest earnings. So that means you're not going to pay as much taxes on any interest that you earn. What are you going to do? You're going to take your money and put it into an interest-bearing asset. Those are savings accounts. Therefore, private savings will increase. This is incentivizing putting your money into a savings account that will earn you interest. So that results in an increase in private savings. Explain how the change in private savings identified in Part D affects the following. All right, so we said private savings increases. What is that going to do to the supply of loanable funds? Increase, and it said explain. Remember, when explain is there, we have to have this causal relationship, so the word because should fit in my answer. It's going to increase because of the increase in private savings behavior. People are putting their money into savings, that increases supply of loanable funds. That's a direct relationship. That's a shifter of the supply curve. What happens to the real interest rate? Well, visualize, and this is, again, on this particular exam, this is where you want to have your scratch paper, draw your loanable funds market, shift your curve to the right, and see what happens. That supply curve shifts to the right, real interest rate's going to decrease because of that rightward shift in the supply of loanable funds. We're not submitting a graph, and in most years, you would be drawing a graph right now. I'm still going to draw the graph for myself because it helps me answer the question. That's what these things are for, but you're not submitting the graph. Use the graph to help you with your explanations here. E3, same concept. You've drawn your graph, you showed the supply shift to the right. What's going to happen to the quantity of loanable funds demanded? It's going to increase. I have to explain. It's going to increase because the negative relationship between real interest rates and the quantity of loanable funds demanded as the supply curve moves along that demand curve. In other words, supply shifted to the right, we moved down and to the right along that demand curve, increasing the quantity of loanable funds demanded. This goes all the way back to day one of demand when you learned about moving along the demand curve as opposed to shifting. It didn't shift, there's no change in demand, but the quantity of loanable funds demanded increased because we're moving along that curve. Okay, on to part F. This is a long question. We don't always see F and don't always see a part G as well, but we do this year. Given the real interest rate change in part E2, what again was that? Real interest rates went down. Answer the following questions. What's the short run effect on aggregate demand? Explain. What's the effect on price level? Explain. Aggregate demand first. Real interest rates went down. How do I connect that to aggregate demand? Aggregate demand will increase. Explain. The decrease in real interest rates will cause an increase in interest-sensitive components of AD. What are those? We think investment first. Most of the time, investment has an inverse relationship with interest rates. So if interest rates go down, investment goes up. But there's also interest-sensitive consumption, purchase of durable goods, those big items where you're going to borrow money. You got to think about interest rates first. So that's going to also increase, causing an increase in aggregate demand. What's the effect on price level? Well, that increase in AD that we just described that stems from the change in interest rates, that's going to cause an increase in price level. The rightward shift in AD results in demand pull inflation. So because investment and consumption go up, AD goes up, demand pull inflation results. Finally, G, in order to reverse the change in price level identified in part F2, would the central bank raise or lower the reserve requirement? So again, got to be consistent here. We saw price level going up. So what could the Fed do to turn that around or slow down the inflation? They'd have to go contractionary, which means they would have to raise the reserve requirement. So we went full circle here. The question started with reserve requirement and it ended with a reserve requirement. All right, that's question one. That's again to simulate what question one looks like. What topics will be on this year's question one, I don't know exactly, but it's all fair game from units 1 through 5. Let's look at question 2. Remember, question 2 is essentially an old question 1, what question 1 would look like in all previous years in terms of its length, and that's why it's a 15-minute question instead of 25 minutes. This was, again, adapted from a previous question 1, but I had to make some adjustments here because we're not drawing graphs, and that, especially on part A, makes things look a lot different than they normally would. So let's walk our way through it. Andoria is an open economy that's currently in a recessionary output gap. Okay, we're going to need that information. Let's look at A. On a correctly labeled graph of LRAS, SRAS, and AD, would the current equilibrium real output be found to the left, to the right, or at full employment output? Go back to that introductory sentence, recessionary output gap. Again, if it's me, scratch paper, I'm drawing ADAS just to check my work because I'm so used to looking at things that way. I'm not going to submit any graphs, but it's going to help me see what I'm looking for. If there's a recessionary output gap, that I know output is to the left of YF, and that's my answer. The central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. All right, stop right there. Again, think what's happening here. So we have a recessionary gap. Output is below full employment, and they're not going to do anything in terms of policy to take us back. Where are they going to go with this question? B1 should be obvious. Explain how the economy will adjust to full employment in the long run. So we're looking at long run self-adjustment here. And how do we get back? We tell the same story every time. If there's no policy action, self-correction comes from lowered inflationary expectations, lowered resource prices, and it's going to shift SRAS to the right. That long-run self-correcting mechanism always works through the short-run aggregate supply curve. So that's the same story we tell. In this case, it's shifting right because we're operating below full employment. B2, would aggregate demand shift right, shift left, or remain the same as the economy adjusts to full employment output? It's going to remain the same. There's nothing that's going to cause aggregate demand to just shift magically. In this case, SRAS is moving and we're moving along the aggregate demand curve. And then part B3, let's incorporate the Phillips curve. Would the short run Phillips curve shift right, shift left, or remain the same as the economy adjusts to full employment output? Well, one very safe connection we can make is that mirror image between SRAS and SRPC. So we said SRAS is going to shift to the right. We know that for the same reasons, SRPC is going to shift to the left. So the answer is shift left. Did not ask for an explanation. We don't need to give one. Part C. All right, now suppose the government is unwilling to wait for the long run adjustment process. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. The equilibrium real output is $500 billion. The full employment output is $520 billion. Okay, we need that information. First of all, I see MPC. I know MPS is 0.2. I also would expect something regarding the spending and or tax multiplier. It just, that's a trigger. That should be a light goes off in my head that says, oh, MPC, I'm thinking multipliers. It may not be there, but it certainly makes sense that it could be there. All right, so be thinking that way. They're now giving me the amount of our output gap. It's still a recessionary gap because we're now skipping over the self-correction portion. We have a $20 billion gap and the government wants to close that $20 billion gap. calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in government spending required to shift the aggregate demand curve by the amount of the output gap. So again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to increase output by $20 billion. We have an MPC. This is a multiplier question. This is the equation that I would use to determine the effects of a change in government spending. A change in output is equal to a change in government spending times the spending multiplier. What information do I have that I can fit into this equation? Well, I know the spending multiplier is 1 over 0.2 or 5. I don't know the change in government spending. I'm looking for that, but I know the desired change in output, and that's 20 billion. So I would plug that in. 20 billion is going to be the change in government spending times the multiplier, which comes out to 20 billion divided by 5. They would increase spending by $4 billion. Assuming the full multiplier effect, spending would go up by 4 billion, and that 4 billion times 5 would increase output by 20 billion. All right, for C2, calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in taxes required to shift the AD curve by the amount of the output gap. Again, same process. We're trying to increase output by 20 billion. The tax multiplier now is negative 4. So 20 billion equals change in taxes times negative 4. They would have to decrease taxes by $5 billion. And again, it's the 20 billion divided by negative 4 equals negative 5. Negative 5 times negative 4 equals 20 billion. Put those two questions together, you get to part 3. Is the magnitude or the absolute value of the minimum change in taxes greater than, less than, or equal to the minimum change in government spending? Explain. All right, for the assertion, I'm just looking at the numbers. 4 billion times 5 billion, obviously the change in taxes is greater than in magnitude. Take away that negative. Why? Why though? It has to do with the nature of the multiplier. And we know the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier in the way that we are calculating them. So one way we could answer that question is to say that while the entire change in government spending will be spent, a portion of the change in taxes will be saved, resulting in a smaller multiplier effect. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. We know the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier, so it requires a greater change in taxes to get the same impact on output. Okay, that's ultimately what we're trying to explain in the second part of C3, that the tax multiplier is less than the spending multiplier. And again, what is the fundamental reason for that? If government spends money, the entire amount is being spent. But if they cut taxes, a portion of that tax cut, that's going to get saved, will not be spent. Part D, assume instead the Central Bank of Andoria takes actions to restore the economy to full employment output by influencing investment spending. Explain how the actions taken by the central bank will impact the equilibrium nominal interest rate illustrated on a correctly labeled graph of the money market. All right, so again, in previous years, you'd be drawing the money market graph, but not this year. Now you're explaining the money market graph. What's going to happen on the money market graph? What can the central bank do to impact nominal interest rates? I've said it, I think, 3 or 4 times today, and that should say something. On my own, I'm sketching it out. I want to see this, but I'm not going to do that in my answer. And when I do that, what I'm going to end up with is that expansionary monetary policy is going to increase money supply, and that increase in money supply will cause nominal interest rates to fall. So interest rates are going to decrease as a result of this expansionary monetary policy. You have to think backwards a little bit here. It's a little bit of backwards deduction where I'm thinking, okay, how could they increase investment spending? Lower interest rates. How would they increase or lower interest rates? Expansionary policy. That's what the question's getting at. And again, we have to be able to verbalize what we would normally show on a graph, in this case, a graph of the money market. All right, and finally, part E, the PPC below represents the economy of Andoria. Point A represents output prior to any policy action. So we understand what the PPC represents. Point A indicates that we're operating below full employment. Assume the policy action from part D has the intended effect on investment spending. Explain how the resulting change in output would be illustrated on the PPC above. Boy, it'd be a lot easier if we could just show it on here, wouldn't it? But we have to verbalize. That's where we are. So what would you show? Well, we're assuming that it has the intended effect. The intended effect was to close the output gap. So there's really going to be 2 parts of this. The first part is that I want to say that output's going to be on the curve. If I were doing point B to show new output, I'd be on the curve. But also, I should mention, we'd be closer to the y-axis. if it's going to increase investment spending, think about what's happening there. There's going to be capital formation. That investment spending is business spending on new capital. So that distribution of resources and the amount of goods being produced is going to skew a little more towards that y-axis and increase the production of capital goods as a result. So ultimately, what's going to happen, we're going to be on the curve and we're going to be closer to capital goods because the increase that occurred, we know came from an increase in investment spending. Okay, that's everything for those 2 questions. I would encourage you to do a few more of these. Go on AP Classroom. There are plenty of practice problems on there. As you know, when you log on, you have that first tab that says practice answering free response exam questions. You can do those at any time. Of course, we'll also be back tomorrow to do 2 more practice questions that are, again, designed like these 2 to replicate what you can expect on exam day. So expect that tomorrow. Come back tomorrow. We'll do the 45-minute practice exam again, and then follow that up on Thursday with another lesson like today's where we go over the answers and consider what needs to be done to answer them correctly. And then Friday, we're going to wrap up things on Friday, send you off with some exam day tips, just a few things to think about as you go into your exam to really, again, boost your confidence and reduce any anxiety going in, because we want you to do well. We want you to take advantage of the fact that you've been working hard and show what you have learned. With that said, thanks for watching. Appreciate you doing this. And I do think it'll pay off for you in the long run. And hope you have a great day and you come back tomorrow. Thanks a lot.